Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. I just made a very lengthy video and published that video, and I felt that I left something out. I felt that I walked away without talking about something that was very important. And what I would like to address is what I believed the Russians were going to be able to do in this conflict. Something very specific that would have negated some of the challenges that the Russian ground forces are experiencing. Two major issues that I felt would cause serious problems for the Ukrainians that ended up, in some cases, not creating the kind of havoc and destruction of Ukrainian forces that I believed was going to occur. And I would say the most important of these two elements, again, the Russian Air Force. While I knew that going into this conflict, the Russians did not have Su-30s, Su-27s flying around with targeting pods. The Su-34, the fullback, has a targeting system on that aircraft that acts somewhat like a quote-unquote targeting pod. Nowhere near a Lockheed Martin system. But nonetheless, it does have the ability on that fullback, the Su-34, to put a bomb on target. So I had believed that going into this conflict, that Russian situational awareness of Ukrainian forces would be of such that the Russians would have been able to drop GLONASS, their version of the JDAM, and cruise missiles on Ukrainian convoys. This bridge, for instance. I had believed that the Russians would take these bridges down. Or at least have the situational awareness with its satellites, other systems that give the Russians the ability to sense targets on the ground, be it human intelligence or technology-based systems. But if a Ukrainian convoy was traveling on this N08 and attempting to move across this bridge, the Russians would know the Ukrainians were moving and then be able to hit those targets. We haven't not seen that happen to the extent that would cripple the movement of the Ukrainian military. And kind of based what happened in Syria, seeing Russian technology in Syria, they had the ability to drop a bomb on a target and hit a target within a reasonable CEP. But Ukrainian air defense capability has negated a lot of this Russian capability. Zelensky, on TV nightly. I had believed going into this conflict that through the use of Russian air power, maybe not a plane, an Su-34 or an Su-24M, flying over Kiev, but a cruise missile or a Iskander system, a ballistic missile, would have made Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, leave Kiev at a risk of being blown up. And the Russians haven't gone after those key leadership targets of the Ukrainians. Haven't seen it happen. They have not taken Zelensky off the air. And I believed going into this that the Russians would have that capability. Why have they not done that? Can't say. Or do they even have the capability to do it? I would think that they do, but I've not seen it. But at the same time, I had believed that the Russians would be able to target Ukrainian forces attempting these crossing points across the Dnieper River, either with cruise missiles or, again, their version of the JDAM, the GLONASS guided bomb, laser guided systems. Now, I know, again, a lot of that was negated by Ukrainian air defenses in tandem with U.S. intelligence. U.S. early warning aircraft flying over western Ukraine or close to the border, letting the Ukrainians know exactly what is happening. But again, going into this, I firmly believed that the Russians would be able to adequately interdict Ukrainian forces. Hasn't happened. Secondly, another area that I had assumed that we would see the Russians excel, and we saw this to a limited extent early in the campaign, and that is aggressive air mobile operations by the Russian airborne forces and its Spetsnaz forces. The Russians made attempts early north of Kiev at Hostomel. And allegedly, we believed, and that I believe that has now been discounted, at this airbase as well. And again, these are parachute infantry air mobile operations against Ukrainian forces. And again, back to Ukrainian air defenses, that has negated the ability of the Russian military to conduct vertical envelopment. But even outside of that, the aggressive use of these special forces, airborne forces, Spetsnaz, and other operations as well, we haven't seen them as successful, again, as I had believed going into this conflict. So I thought I would address that, because again, I just can't express enough how the lack of a modern interdiction-based air force is hurting this Russian campaign. If the enemy can't move, and the enemy fears getting a JDAM dropped on his head whenever he goes into convoy, that is going to prevent convoy movement. And again, most analysts believed the Russians had that capability. Maybe not the same type of sensor-based capability, but at least human-based intelligence in conjunction with some of this technology as well. Haven't really seen it. We've seen it in some cases, but it hasn't been successful enough to prevent these large operations by Ukrainian forces. And yes, if you compare and contrast, again, I've seen those comments where where folks say, well, just because the Russians aren't performing like the U.S. military, well, yeah, the U.S. military would have interdicted the Ukrainian military. They would put bombs on these convoys en route to wherever they're going, accurately and constantly. And given this is, again, is in the backyard of the Russian Federation, you would think that capability would have been there. This is not like Syria in terms of distance. The Russians have all kinds of airfields running from Crimea all along and east of the border with Ukraine, including Belarus. Hard to understand, hard to get one's head around. But again, I think you can when you see how much support the Ukrainians are getting from the West in terms of situational awareness information coming in. So I felt that needed to be talked about at in even greater detail, in where you can understand where kind of the channel's coming from in terms of deficiencies in the Russian ongoing operation. Anyway, that covers that. Have a good day, everybody.